Well, howdy, Jay.
Ben, internet,
Internet.
greetings.
Somebody asked me, they were like, "Hey, are you going to have like a standard opening, for the circuit?" And I was like, I think I'm just going to roll with whatever mood I'm in that day. It's going to be like the opening is like a box of chocolates. You never know, you never know what you're going to get
I think we should have theme music. It should be battle without honor or humanity,
for
which is the
humanity
no, it's battle without honor or
without
humanity.
honor. Nice, nice.
It's yeah.
Cheering sounds. I could add cheering sounds. I see that here on the left. Maybe an elephant whistle, bullhorn. Man, the creative juices can go when you're trying to produce something. Um, Thanks everybody, listeners, for all the positive feedback that you've given me in emails and messages on Twitter. I also wanted to mention there is a YouTube channel. Jay and I are staring at each other right now as we do this in real time. Just pointing that out, that there's a YouTube channel in case you want to watch us. Maybe someday we'll get sophisticated enough to throw up some of the visuals that we talk through, because I have charts and other things that might be interesting. So, aspirations abound. But capitalizing on last week, where we talked about what's going on in foundries, packaging and process, I had already been thinking about kind of this topic, but a few people hit me up in Twitter DMs and mentioned doing it on really the de-globalization trend. Jay and I, we've talked about this a little bit on what it looks like when you're trying to bring some form of the semi industry back to your nation. There's a lot of implications for this. There's obviously the geopolitical side, which we sort of danced around and can weave into this, and will also necessitate, I think, another series of podcasts. But I want to talk sort of broadly about deglobalization. I'll sort of throw my point out there, Jay, and then I'll let you chime in. It's hard to not appreciate that the semiconductor industry is a global partnership. Even with talks with senior executives at all the name companies out there, and I talk about, look, what when sanctions come down and governments are trying to get you to invest in domestic foundries or domestic technology, they always keep coming back to, yes, we're going to do that, but again, remember, the semiconductor industry is a global partnership, and I think that's an important framework to remember. We can dive into what regions have a share of what, whether that's lithography or wafer or memory or foundry. But the meta point, and I'll let you just chime in, is just we can't forget that this is a global partnership. And more importantly, to satisfy the needs of the semiconductor industry, which is now a little over 1 trillion semiconductors shipped every year, it will always be a global partnership.
Yeah. There is so much complexity and there's so many little bits and pieces of it. Even I've been doing this for 20 something years. You've been in it at least as long. Like I am always finding some new company that I'd never heard of that actually, oh, they have this critical role to play in match sets, right? Or some random chemical that's incredibly important and there's only one vendor for it. There's just a lot going on and it's everywhere. As much as the headlines are all about Taiwan, there's a whole lot upstream from that, or right, that goes into that, all kinds of inputs. And it's a pretty complicated. I mean, it's part of what makes it fun. There's always something interesting to explore and discover in this space.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, just doubling down on the points of every nation can be ambitious, right? China can, America can, Europe can, Japan can, Korea can, etc. Everybody can be ambitious, but they're never going to own the whole stack. And so I always just worry, like, how much, say, if said nation brings down sanctions, and you can't end up, and I think you're seeing this right now, right, with some of the tension that's going between what the US is trying to say about ASML and then Europe saying, like, no, we're not going to abide by that because we need this to be a global trade scenario, is how much do sometimes those regulations maybe hurt you more than help you, even if your underlying intentions can be good, if that makes sense.
There's a lot in there. There's a lot in there to unpack, right? I'm not even sure where to start. I think once you start talking about nation state levels, it gets even more complicated, layered on top of an already complicated industry. Um, but it cuts both ways, right? I mean, there's lots of reasons why the U.S. put sanctions on China's chip industry, and there's some of that resonates with other countries as well. I really think the Europeans, there's large blocks in Europe who feel pretty strongly we're in line with what the U.S. is doing, even if they're individual companies or entities that are going to are going to object to it. Like ASML is going to feel a lot of pain from these sanctions, right?
Yeah,
But they're a Dutch company, and the Dutch government probably feels a pretty different way.
sure.
And so let's we'll tackle that as best as we can. Um, I do want to take a step back though and talk about how every country now seems to want to have a semiconductor fab domestic, and I think that there is lots of good reasons why that's not going to happen, why it hasn't happened historically, and why it shouldn't happen, right? Because I know like the big thing I've been hearing a lot about recently is Mexico, right? There's lots of interest in building up Mexico's semiconductor industry.
Right.
I talked to some people in the policy world about that recently, and they sent me a list of questions beforehand. They said, what are the best fabs in Mexico? I don't think Mexico has any fabs. They have a couple. They have a couple OSAT facilities that are very good, but they don't have a fab. And then I started looking up like if you're going to build a center of semiconductor excellence in Mexico, where do you even start? Right? Like they have some very good universities there, but I don't think any of them have really advanced semis content in their electrical engineering department. Historically, for whatever reason, that hasn't been an area they specialized in. So now you suddenly want to grow a whole industry in Mexico from scratch. Absolutely, that is possible. There are lots of talented engineers in Mexico. But is that really how the government wants to spend its energies? Is it something feasible? I mean, it's possible. It's going to take 20 years, but it's possible. So I think, we sort of started off with this being really complicated, and it is, if you want to change that, it's going to take a lot of time. We didn't just sort of flip a switch and suddenly we're dependent on Taiwan. It took 20, 30 years to get here, and reversing it is going to take just as long.
Yeah. And I think, when we talked about, even this last time, right, we didn't go deep on each nation's efforts as a foundry. I mean, we talked a little bit about how Intel's trying to be competitive in foundry, as is Samsung. Samsung's most competitive foundries in logic, or at least a good portion of them, are actually here on U.S. soil, right? Memory, I think, may still be in Korea. But I think you look at, we talked about TSMC only being able to do a small portion. Estimates have far less than 10%. Generally, I think most analysts on the sell side are 4 to 5% of their capacity, which really just says it's not even in the entirety of their U.S. customers. It's some small set. I think you had pointed out like defense and a few others, right? Maybe Apple locally, if the government says you've got to have X% of content to import to the United States. But I think just understanding, to your point, right, which is that one, logic foundries are big, expensive. I mean, as far as I know, also, ASML's sales are locked up for the next few years. It's not like there's just machines coming off the table that somebody can just kind of buy to start a new foundry. It's a limited resource. It is the challenge, but I keep coming back to, it's not just even lithography. It's not just the foundry. It's the wafers, it's the, it's etching. It's everything that becomes a part of that ecosystem, that there's only small bits that reside in certain places, and everybody relies on each other to get those done. Like it doesn't even exist. In fact, I'd be curious. I don't know if such a stat exists, but per the entire needs of the semiconductor ecosystem, what country has all of all of X% of all of those things, because I can't imagine it would be gigantic. It would be they have some percent of all of those things, but like somebody doesn't have 50% foundry, 50% wafer, 50% lithography. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no majority in those key categories in any one country.
We could spend an hour just talking about the denominator of that fraction.
Yeah,
What do you want to
for
put
sure.
in there, right?
Right, right.
I mean, the U.S. is probably closest, not closest, furthest, like has the biggest share of any of it, has the biggest share of every single part of that, right? But certainly we can, end device manufacturer. But I think that's why the U.S. thinks that we can get away with these sanctions is
Right.
ultimately, even for pieces that aren't produced here, there are going to be dependencies you can trace back to U.S. companies and U.S. IP.
Right.
That's certainly the case with ASML, but I think it's true for everyone else, every other part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder too. I mean, I think you're right. I don't know. I've never seen such a stat. I mean, you look at obviously Intel's here, Applied Materials, Lam, just again, just companies that have pieces of that. It's not all made here, but there's a lot of American companies in that mix. Obviously, with the exception of lithography, but it's interesting to your point, like the investments that people are trying to make, and I just keep coming back to again the implications of this, or the implications to the rest of the ecosystem. Like again, just going back to your point about ASML, like being possibly hurt by these sanctions, and then other countries getting frustrated. Is how much does this often hurt your overall ambition, versus help it in other countries that might need to return the favor or put sanctions on U.S. companies trying to do those things. That's just kind of where my head keeps just bouncing around. I guess the positive, negative impacts or unintended circumstances of some of this attempt to de-globalize the semiconductor industry.
So I actually think, there's a few things that come out of it. One is I'm a big believer in, what do you call it, multilateralism, like working with allies, like working with partners. And I think that's one of the great successes of the U.S. has had over the last 70 years has been its ability to work with allies closely. And so in times of need, like now, when we have concerns about China's military capabilities,
Yeah.
we can call on our allies and get their help. And it's particularly important now because for the last 5 years, China has been going down this really sort of very ultra nationalistic wolf warrior diplomacy track.
Yeah.
Where they're almost rude to everybody else. And it's a very, very sharp, aggressive diplomatic style. And it's now coming back to haunt them, right? And it looks like they've sort of stepped away from it. But they're now in a position where they can't go to the Dutch government, they can't go to the Czech government, they can't go to all these different European governments because their in-country diplomats have been insulting those host countries for the last few years about whatever random things. And now suddenly the U.S. is actually asking for a favor from those countries, and
Right.
China's saying, no, don't do that. We were kidding. It's important to have allies. And, there are lots of people who are going to argue, oh, maybe the U.S. isn't such a good ally and we've done all these bad things. Yeah, okay, I'm not trying to debate all of history here. But, I think there are lots of countries that have benefited in some ways from being an ally of the U.S. and we've tried to do right by them.
Yep.
Within bounds. And so that's why I actually am pretty fairly high degree of confidence that these sanctions will take place and that we will have all of our allies sign up to participate. And China is going to be very isolated. Right? And hopefully what that leads to is its approach to the world and recognizing that there's a better path, a more diplomatic path towards being integrated and still being able to get what they want, being able to satisfy their development goals without antagonizing the rest of the world, without picking a fight with everybody else.
So I'm curious about this, and you lead to a point that I had been thinking about and floated to again said executives at a number of different semiconductor companies. Like, do you think that there would ever be an official equivalent to what we're talking about, allies and technology, to like a tech NATO, where said countries are in agreement with each other against a, call it, I hate to say China's a common enemy, but somebody in which they're trying to regulate and use their leverage with, again, this in this case components, as a part of that. I'm saying formally. Obviously, they could do this informally, like we handshake, we talk. But do you ever think something like that would be possible, where they're like, "Hey, we recognize we all need each other. Let's agree on said things, but this country is not in it, and so we're going to monitor them in some degree, right? They're not in this tech node." I'm just curious if there's ever could show up like a formal partnership in this capacity.
I mean, my initial response is that question is way above my pay grade. I'm just a financial analyst. Uh, Investor relations, excuse me, international relations is beyond me. It's the other IR.
The other
Um,
IR.
but from what I can tell, there are attempts being made at doing just that, right? There's the group of four. I forget what it's called. There's like U.S., U.S., Taiwan, South Korea, Japan are trying to put something like that together. Or I shouldn't say they're trying to put it together. There's been talks about that right there, and there are other blocks the U.S. is trying to put together to sort of not confront, but to sort of deal with China with other allies in other areas, right? Bring India into some sort of security arrangement, something like that. And I won't say never. That's never going to happen, but it's hard to do, especially
Very.
because so much of what we're talking about is commercial, right? We're talking about companies, and companies are all going to have interests in their own interests at heart, which are going to conflict with their government's interests. Right? When it's a military bloc, that's fairly easy. The government controls the military, and the military does what everybody gets in gear. But when it's commercial, you have entities who are capable of pushing back and resisting, and I think that makes it much harder to cobble one of those things together unless there's some really really clear benefit to them. Which I think we were starting to reach that point with China and semis, right? It's gotten so much harder for tech companies to do business in China over the last 10 years that when the Trump trade war started, and now these latest sanctions, there's some pushback from the chip companies, but they're not fighting it at a broad policy level. They're not vocal about it. They're not public about it.
Yeah.
Right? And yeah, I mean, I think it'd be interesting to sort of flip it around and think about, could China respond in some constructive way? And
Right.
I've published on this. Like, they don't actually have an easy response to the U.S. sanctions.
Right.
And you look at their response since October to the China chip sanctions, they've been very muted because they don't want to make a big deal about it because there's no obvious counter for them, right? And so I wonder how that will change as China's economy continues to advance and develop. Are there going to be areas where they do find some leverage, right? And the one that sort of leaps to mind first and foremost is batteries. Like, they have some really really big battery companies. Could they cobble together? I don't even know where other batteries are made. South Korea,
Yeah. South Korea.
Japan, like probably some minerals and places where they actually have friends that they could cobble together. And it's very hard for them to do that.
So that was what I actually wanted to get your perspective on too, just to define, because I know you're much closer to the Chinese side. So just for everybody listening, looking at this, in logic, China is basically 17% of capacity, and in memory 20%. Now the logic is mostly lagging and far nowhere near leading edge, basically super legacy. Clearly no no advantage or levers there in proprietary IP, other than the fact that it's cost effective. Similar to memory, you and I know a big company who's using some memory from them because it's cheap. That may not always be the case if the United States doesn't want
Not
to.
anymore. They're not. Not anymore. They're not.
Okay, dropped in said products, but we're using said memory. But again, no competitive advantage, just kind of cost. So I am curious again to your point on that. So like you mentioned the levers, and maybe it is battery, but I don't think I think most companies still need them for trailing edge. Like I'm not sure that other foundries have enough capacity trailing edge to meet the demands. I kind of feel like that is there. So again, not that that's their advantage is they have a lot of capacity in trailing edge. Not that there's anything unique there, but I don't know. Global Foundries, I don't think has enough to satisfy the needs of the industry. Intel definitely doesn't. I'm just curious your perspective. Like, does it come back to that basic fundamental point? Well, we've got all the capacity, nobody else does.
I think that argument has lost a lot of its steam in the last 6 months because there aren't a lot of segments that are seeing tight capacity anymore, right? In trailing edge, like trailing edge was going to be the last to come off, and I think for the most part, we starting to see a significant loosening in legacy capacity just in the last few months, right? And the China fabs felt it 2 months before that, right? Quotes getting from China fabs now for 200 millimeter wafers, 60 whatever nanometer, 65 nanometer and up, 180 nanometer and up. I mean, those prices are down 50% this year, at least, because they're just desperate to fill their lines. So yes, they have capacity, but I don't think that's not a scarce resource, and it's certainly not a reliable one because I think there's still a lot of plans in the U.S. to add capacity. And I think that's one of the big changes that's taken place is the U.S. industrial base, especially automotive, has woken up to the fact that they're very dependent on China and that they're at the end of the queue when it comes to capacity. And they are very likely to take some steps in the next few years to address that. I'm more worried that the U.S. is going to have overcapacity in trailing edge in a year or two, just based on some of the plans people have in place. So I don't think that really. And then is long advantage.
So okay, so that's a good point. I think, and I've sort of pointed this out too with some things I've said on Twitter. Like the one area that I think it is constrained is the leading edge, and call that 5 nanometer and beyond. Obviously, 3 nanometer is going to be super constrained from TSMC. But before I make a broader point about that, everybody's also trying to call it onshore some manufacturing. I again think this is going to be really hard. So I guess the question is, how much maybe leverage would China have on the manufacturing front, where enough companies still have to go there to have some form of assembly? Do you think that could still be an area? Maybe their leverage is just going to be where we could still just pull on something there. We have some leverage with assembly because you might not always be able to cut us out, or at least everybody may not be able to cut them out.
So if I was a U.S. company and I decided I want to stop any reliance on China today, where would I be stuck, right? And I think in semis, it's packaging and test. Like I'm probably pretty reliant on China for that at this point. Even if I'm getting it from a U.S. or a Southeast Asian company, chances are the facilities in China. And then there's final assembly. Everything else I can probably source somewhere else. But that being said, those alone are a pretty significant piece of the pie here, right? And it's not something that's easily fixed. I couldn't shut off my back end flows quickly. It would be really, really scary to do that.
Yeah. Well,
so
and I think
a few years to move it.
I think it airs to at least where you're seeing some successful moving out of China for those parts of assembly is not terribly high volume areas. PCs are doing this now. Every major PC OEM is moving into some version of Taiwan. Actually, on that point, I'm not sure if you browse the halls at CES or if you had time, but it was interesting, and I tweeted this, years ago. We should have hit you up when you were there because that would have been fun for the three of us to do this. But years ago, Benedict Evans and I would just go in the Shenzhen halls and just look at like everything that they were making at scale. It went from like e-cigarettes to vapors to selfie sticks, like just stuff that was going on, like all contract manufacturing. And it was interesting because this year, there was a lot less from Shenzhen, but partially that was probably because a lot of COVID. I don't think they could all get out of the country, but there was a lot more from, Malaysia and Vietnam, India, even France, like other countries had shown up with contract manufacturing booths. And again, not that they can do that scale. It was just several years ago, those companies were never there showing contract manufacturing, and now they were. And I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, but I think that scale part is the key, right? You and I could go out and mill up an iPhone, and we could spend, that could be our hobby, take a year and build our own iPhone, right? But that's not the hard part. The hard part is doing 400 million of
Yeah.
them a year, and
Right.
and there's no place else in the world that can do that than China. So I
Right.
was working with a company 2 years ago, and it was the middle of COVID, so that was a little bit of a factor. But we just couldn't get to China, and so we wanted to manufacture a little IoT device, and we were trying to get it built in the U.S. And it was so painful. It was just so painful,
Yep.
right? Every step of the way, we had a contract manufacturer, but they they didn't know how to do things, right? Oh, what's that? We've never seen that machine before. Like we had to like literally rent a machine for them, ship it to their floor ourselves, and then go out and train their employees how to use it, right? And every time there was a change, it was a hassle. Like in Shenzhen, none of that exists. Like, oh, you need a new machine? All right, I'm going to call up the guy down the block. He's got 5. He'll lease them to me for 3 months, right? And he has a team of people who just do that, just work on that machine, and we'll contract them out for that time. Right?
Yeah.
The depth of manufacturing expertise in China is immense. And I think, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Is just like manufacturing as a competitive advantage. Manufacturing as a skill is
Yep.
something I don't want to say we lost it in the U.S., but certainly China has an immense advantage, and we definitely don't have it for consumer electronics the way that China has.
Yeah, not even close. And it's tricky too because a lot of organizations who did work with China for mass manufacturing at scale, they imparted a lot of their own proprietary manufacturing knowledge to aid in that efficiency. I think Ben Thompson pointed this out in a note a bit ago about how much Apple has also invested in knowledge to their foundries, and that collaboration has led to a situation they just can't get out of because they have created, in some cases, like manufacturing process that the said companies couldn't do on their own to help them scale their products, and that's not going to get moved out. But Apple's not the only one that's done that, and so you kind of again come back to this: what can I do at scale? What can I can't? And that's why I sort of just come back to what leverage could they pull in this again if something like an unofficial tech NATO happened and tries to hit them with sanctions, like what levers can they pull? And I still feel like this element of manufacturing could get really tricky if they wanted it. I mean, again, they could just shoot themselves in the foot. And so your argument could be, well, they won't do that. There's, I don't know if you've seen this stat, but somebody gave this to me. I can't say who, but that in some regions, Apple is almost 2% of GDP. So like if they just were like, oh, hey, we're not going to, like, they would shoot themselves economically in the foot to cut Apple off from something like that, right? So you could argue there's an
Yeah,
economic reason that they don't, but I just keep coming back to if everything hits the fan and it just gets really ugly, what could they pull? And I just, at scale manufacturing is one of those things they could get really difficult with if they wanted to.
yeah. I saw a stat that said there are 5 million people in China employed by Apple, not directly, but through multiple layers of contractors and subcontractors. And so putting 5 million people out of work, even in China, that's a big number.
Yeah.
You just they don't want to mess with that. Um, I, I've been watching. I was watching this video on TikTok recently about this guy is a captain of a giant Suez Max container ship, and he's in dry dock now somewhere in East China, and it's just like this incredible. It's basically a manufacturing. They're cleaning up the ship and overhauling it, right? So it's basically a manufacturing process, refurbing a ship, and it's just like it's just staggeringly complicated, like laser guided everything, and like hundreds of people, and just the sheer amount of capital invested in that, and having all these skilled workers on site able to do the job. It's and
Yep.
there's three ships just like his sitting in the next two dry docks over, like
Yep.
that scale of things, and that's not ships. That's just very straightforward metal bending. And
Yep. Yep.
I, right, and you see that too. I mean, if you want to get really alarmist, we can look at um, production of naval ships, China versus the U.S. China is just off the charts
Yeah.
ahead of us. I mean, our fleet
Yeah.
is much bigger, but theirs is growing ridiculously fast because there's huge capacity to build ships in China.
Yep.
And so,
Yep.
you sort of
Well,
apply the same logic applies to manufacturing of electronics. Like, you think about it, from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, it's about 100 miles. And there's thousands of companies and millions, tens of millions of people employed, and they're all doing some part of electronics manufacturing. And it's just
yep.
like it's so deep and so evolved. It's complicated. And
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to Patrick McGee at the Financial Times.
Yep.
He
His
actually
article's
just
good.
published he just published on this, and I I did some, he quoted me a couple times, and I did some background work with him, but like he really dug into the subject. It's an amazingly sourced piece, just looking at like how China got so deep in how Apple got so deep into China, and talking on those topics you were just mentioning, like how they really helped Foxconn and its subcontractors learn how to do this. Um, and Apple's special. They're clearly in a class of their own when it comes to these things. But you think about all the other companies that aren't Apple who taught their Chinese JV partner how to do these things, and then said, "All
Yeah.
right, we're not going to do this
Exactly.
at home. We'll just let you do
Yep.
it."
Yep. No, and there's plenty of those. And you bring up this other excellent point is that their economy at large related to this is not just the manufacturing. They're also very good at exporting those goods from town to town onto ships, onto packages at a scale that no other country could do. And I didn't know this. You probably know this, but I bought one of those shipping containers for storage in the backside of my yard. For people who don't know, I have a small mini farm and animals, and I needed something to put like my tractor and a whole host of other stuff. And I was like, why, how are we able to buy, these shipping containers for, $3,000? And they're like, oh, China just makes them, ships them over here and leaves them. They don't want them back because it would just cost too much. So they just keep making new ones on their grounds, new shipping containers on a regular basis. I was like, so there's people out there just mass producing shipping containers, and all they're there, one-time disposable usage. I was like, that's insane. China doesn't want them back, so we can just sort of sell them because it's cheaper for them to make a new one. And I was like, that's crazy. Uh,
Yeah. Hopefully, some of that will ease up now that the shipping industry is rationalizing, but probably also means you can get them for even less now.
yeah. Believe me, but the point is, there's just so many parts of that
Right.
of their machine that you just can't do, especially at the costs, right? I mean, as long as I would be curious too, like, this is just absolute hypothetical, but if China was to ever become democratic, would that drastically, it would have to have some impact on economics. Like they would start charging a little bit more.
Well, let's take the politics out of it. Like, set aside the issue of democracy or any kind of government change in China. I think just the law of economics and demography are going to dictate changes in this model, right? And we've already seen it. China is no longer the low-cost labor hotspot, right? China labor has gotten fairly expensive, right? Certainly, if you want to hire like a semiconductor engineer, that's super expensive. And we
Yeah.
saw that in over the last year. Like there have been multiple uh, labor actions, strikes or whatnot, at Foxconn and other plants, right? And that there's lots of reasons behind that, but a big part of it is just sheer economics. Those employees want to get paid more, and so and you add that to the fact that China's labor force is probably at the point it's shrinking now. Labor in China has gotten expensive. Their
Right.
advantage is not low cost labor anymore. Right? That's why textiles are moving to Bangladesh, right? Places like that,
Right.
because it's lower. It's much lower cost labor. So I think we're heading to that point now where China's. I mean, I think that's the root of all this is China is looking for its next leg in development. They've done really well on 30, 40 years of being low cost labor. They've maxed that out. And now they need to find new sources of sort of fundamental economic
Right.
growth. And they have to move up the value chain. That's sort of right. But the problem is once you get to a certain point in that, it becomes much harder.
Right.
And I think to some degree they're a little bit stuck.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So I want to end on this topic because it's something I've thought about and I'm sort of curious your take. I wrote this article a while back called "The Great Tech Wall of China," and it was really just me pointing out, that they are continually trying to keep themselves in a box, or at least do a lot of stuff locally, keep people out, but to some degree, they're just not having the same success taking their whatever their IP is or product or solutions and as global as possible. And so I always thought about this. So what's the broad, like how dependent would the Chinese ecosystem on, like, let's just assume they figure out semis, they figure out, more in memory, and they're completely self-sustainable. Well, from an economic standpoint, how critical is it that they take those technologies and have global success, or are they totally fine just being self-sufficient to their own content?
No, their whole economic model is premised on exports, right? And so if they move to entire self-sufficiency, with assuming the other side of that trade agreement reacts to that and cuts them off, China's economy would be a big mess. Like this is a very serious problem with China's economy right now. Is it's incredibly export dependent. If you look at like the domestic Chinese economy is in some ways dominated by the big state-owned firms, or even and
Of course,
not so big ones too. Right?
Sure,
but
sure.
but they're all losing money, hand over fist. Right? None of them are profitable. Right? And they make their it's viable because they get cheap loans from the banks, and the banks are propped up because they have huge pools of U.S. dollars that they've gotten from the export economy.
Yep.
And so if China's export engine stalls, they have to sort of redefine their whole economy. They're probably going to have to do it anyway, but as it stands now, it's all about exports.
Yep. So in this case, so again, come back to like semi. So a part of for this investment to make sense, or for them to onshore semis, it can't just be for local products. They need other people in the world to buy those products, which means they have to be competitive, or this model's not going to work.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I think most economists in China and a lot of serious economists outside of China recognize that China has to shift its economy from a very investment-driven place where it is today to a consumer-driven one. And so I would argue China is better off not worrying about self-reliance on semis and instead focus on growing its domestic demand, growing its domestic consumption. Because that ultimately will be the big, the best way to save their domestic companies and prop up their domestic economy. Because once you start to see a big domestic market supporting local companies, that will shift all these trade equations incredibly.
Right.
And there's some serious structural changes that will entail. But I think to make it, again, let's bring it back to semis. One place we're starting to see that a little bit is around electric vehicles. Right. This is my big topic of the year is Chinese electric vehicle makers are on fire. They're all growing 20, 50, 100% a year. And they need a lot of semis. And I think that's a lot of China's semi industry today. Domestic parts are going into China's auto industry. And if, and it's only EVs are probably 20% of China's cars today. If they get to 80%, then that's enough to support a pretty healthy, robust Chinese semiconductor industry.
Right. That's a good point. Interesting. So do you think there will ever come another scenario like we saw with Huawei where product companies there just get cut off from the rest of the world products? Because again, I tend to agree with you, right? Don't worry about onshoring semis as long as you can get it from other places. What happens if they can't get it from other places? Then that completely destroys their consumer electronics industry as a whole, outside of a few pockets, like you point out. So that's why I kind of go back to how much of this is an attempt at a defensive, we need to do this just in case, versus the reality of, could they truly get cut off from components from the rest of the world?
I think that's the big question I still have about the U.S. government's intentions. Are they just trying to cut off China's military and its advanced compute capacities, or are they trying to stifle the entire Chinese economy?
Right.
And if you talk to most U.S. government people, they say, no, it's just the military. But no one in China believes that. Everyone in China assumes that it's the whole Chinese economy. And cars are one of those places where it's going to become very, very clear very soon what's going to happen. Because the U.S. government has the sanctions weapons, and you listen to those policy people talk, they're pretty excited about this shiny new toy they have. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume that there are going to be a lot more companies added to the entity list or whatever sub list that leads into that, and very likely that some of those will really crimp. You do that enough times, you can really crimp lots of other parts of China's economy, not just the export electronic stuff, but the automotive stuff.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, what if the world has autonomy? Somebody really have autonomous vehicles, and China cannot get access to advanced semiconductors for any autonomous vehicle companies. That's it. They're done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so,
and that's the thing is like our U.S. companies who are dependent on that revenue don't want that to happen. But I agree with you that's the risk. This, I'm sure, is a topic we'll revisit multiple times, even though it stresses me out and just makes me want to accelerate digging a bunker in my backyard.
It's very stressful. It really is stressful.
All right. Well, good chat in this episode. Thanks everybody for listening, and can continue to give us your thoughts and feedback, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.